flexibility in the digital revolution. I'm really happy to have such a fantastic panel here today. We kind of encompass so much of the different aspects of work. We have trade unions, we have representatives of the digital economy, apprenticeships, we have our sponsor, Virgin Money, one of the leading and most innovative financial services and banking firms in the UK economy, and of course, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work Pensions, Jonathan Ashworth. So I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have. I also think this is actually a conversation about work and labour markets is remarkably one that is hugely important right now for the British economy. It always is, but it's especially important at a time of high inflation, a record high number of vacancies, very low unemployment, and yet still very high non-participation rates. And despite the fact that it's actually quite a tight labour market, it looks like real wages are projected to fall this year and next year. It's a really difficult time in a macro sense. But this is obviously tied into also very profound micro trends around the changing nature of work, flexible working, hybrid working, about changing commuting patterns, the nature of management, how we manage in a hybrid economy, how we measure productivity in a hybrid economy, data, workers' data, discussions around privacy. These are all incredibly important trends in the future of work and in the labour markets. So I'm really excited for the discussion we're going to have this afternoon. And I'd like to first turn it over to our sponsor, Morgan Bowen from Virgin Money, who will speak to sort of what Virgin is doing in this space. And then I'll head around. I think I'll go next to Kate Bell, at the Head of Rights and International at the TUC, and then to Doniya Soni-Clark, who can speak to Head of Policy at Multiverse, leading and very innovative apprenticeship and educational firm. And then I'll go to Francis Lasok from the Coalition for Digital Economy, and then we'll go to the Shadow Secretary of State to sum up. So if I can start with you, Morgan.
All right, Connor, thank you very much. My name is Morgan Bone. I'm Head of Corporate Affairs for Virgin Money. We're the sponsors of this event, in case you missed the big banner going up. Apologies for that. We weren't late starting because of that, just to be clear. Thanks very much for the opportunity to go first. I don't want to take too long, because I suspect that the Q&A is more interesting than the kind of prepared speeches. But Connor asked me just to give a sort of short introduction to our working philosophy. So we have a colleague proposition called A Life More Virgin, and it's worth, I hope, trying to give you just a little bit of sort of thought and insight behind what drove that. So, as the banner says, our purpose is making you happier about money, and that doesn't mean you as a customer. It means every you. So you as a customer, you as a prospective customer, but also you as an employee. We, like many other firms at the beginning of the pandemic, sent everybody from offices to go and work at home. That process was sort of quite fraught, but worked with a reasonable degree of success. It was obviously quite dependent upon getting the technology working, as it was for lots of other firms. But that we sort of got through that gate, and that was okay. But we took the opportunity at that point to think, okay, we've just undergone the biggest sort of transformation in working practices on a sort of unexpected and unforeseen basis. So why don't we take the opportunity at this juncture, unconstrained by what we thought was the requirement to be in an office, to think about what the colleague proposition is and what it should be. We wanted to make sure that we thought a lot about health and well-being, about support for parents and carers. We also wanted to try and think about whether we could and should be more reflective of the communities in which we operate. I think that the key thing for us about creating the Life More Virgin proposition is that all through the process we have not thought that we knew the right answer, so we have sought not to be predictive and prescriptive for colleagues about what the working experience should be like. So we surveyed 3,000 people, the majority of whom were employees, but by no means all. We surveyed members of the public as well, to ask questions about what they wanted as individuals and as members of communities and members and families, what they wanted from their work experience. The short answer was flexibility. So whether it was flexibility of hours, whether it was flexibility of location, whether it was flexibility with respect to the days that they worked, but it was very, very clear from that process that flexibility was a requirement, but the requirements were each individual. So there was no standard protocol that came out of it that we thought, okay, we can deploy that across the organisation because that will work for most people, because it just didn't. It just doesn't work like that. So we effectively came up with a proposition which was and I have to caveat this by saying, we're not able to offer this for all of our employees currently, because there are some people who are store-based, for example. But for most of our employees, we say you dictate it. We won't say you need to be in an office 1 day or 4 days or 5 days. You individually and you with your teams work out what works for you. And if that means, if you have the ability to do it, if that means working in shift hours, if that means working concentrated periods, if that means working on the go, if that means sitting in your car staring at a lake whilst doing emails and phone calls, that's fine, but it's up to you. The choice is yours. We wanted to make sure, though, that was backed up with commitments and policies from us as an organisation that supported that. So to try to prove that we were serious about colleague well-being, we introduced 5 additional well-being days. So that's over and above people's holiday entitlement. People are encouraged to take those additional 5 days to do something that looks after their own well-being. And we try to role model as individuals within the organisation talking about that. So our senior leadership team, for example, when they take their own well-being days, we ask them to get onto LinkedIn. We post around the firm in some of the internal communications, talking about what they have done with those well-being days. We introduced gender neutral parental leave. We introduced locationless hiring. That for us has been fantastic. We have offices based in Gosforth, offices based in Glasgow, some offices based in London. But what we're now seeing as a consequence of the change in working approaches, we have access to a talent pool which we just weren't getting there before. So that's been fantastic, right? And but we definitely do not have all the answers. It's an evolutionary process. We're trying to keep listening. We're trying to keep asking questions of both our own colleagues and the wider public. But for us, it's worked. Applications are up, attrition is down, and employee engagement is better than it's been in years. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Kate, Virgin has put forward, I think, actually quite a progressive view of what an employer can be. You're at the Trade Union Congress. Is this representative? Is this sort of what you're seeing? Or is this very much best practice that you would look to apply similar, you'd advocate for similar things in the workplaces where you advocate for workers?
Well, we represent workers right across the economy, and of course different workplaces have got, different potentials to use technology to enhance the future of work. And I think it's really important to say that we are very optimistic about the future of work, and we're optimistic about how technology can improve it. And as Morgan was talking about, we saw in the pandemic how technology enabled a high degree of flexibility for some workers, although I think it's really important to remember it was some workers. It was about, I think, 40% of people were ever working from home, which means 60% of people weren't. They were still driving our buses, stacking our shelves, delivering our groceries. But, technology has got a huge potential to enhance that flexibility. It's also got a huge potential to boost our productivity. At the moment in the UK, business is basically on an investment strike. I'm not sure that Friday's announcements are going to have improved that very much. I was looking at making you happier about money and thinking that's not necessarily the most apt slogan for how the country is feeling right now. But of course, we want to see technology being used to grow the green industries of the future, in improving our services, and actually making sure that work is safer, more productive, and more rewarding for everybody. But I think we are quite concerned at the moment that one of the ways in which innovation in the workplace is taking place is not necessarily about making work better, but actually making work more tightly controlled. And we've been doing quite a lot of work looking at the use of artificial intelligence in workplaces. And unfortunately, often that's being used to basically replace the management function and to take away tasks that were done by a human and replace them through artificial intelligence. So some work we did a couple of years ago said that up to a quarter of workers were now saying that artificial intelligence was being used to make decisions about how they work, whether that was absence management, ratings, kind of instructions about how you do your role, timetables on work, and sometimes access to training. And some union reps have actually reported to us that technology is being used in disciplinary procedures, which I think is a particularly worrying concern. In some cases, actually selecting who's going to be made vulnerable to redundancy. And of course, you will have heard about the kind of potential equality implications for this, when tech that's been trained on a certain set of characteristics is replicating those characteristics when it looks at performance management and when it looks at who they think is, performing in the job and sometimes in selection too. So I think we want to see kind of technology being harnessed for good, but in order for that to happen, we need that to be happening in a kind of framework of new rights. And we've published what we've called our AI Manifesto, which is really about making sure that the heart of kind of the ways in which tech is being used, particularly in the management relationship, make sure that that's still a relationship between two people and not necessarily just between a worker and kind of an algorithm. Some of our proposals for how to do that are just about consulting your workforce, about when you introduce technology into the workplace and how it's going to be used. We think there should be a new duty to consult, and we do that through trade unions, as you'd expect. We think the UK's data protection regime, I'm not sure if we're getting a data bill anymore, but we were looking at that to perhaps contain some kind of very clear protections against discriminatory data processing and making sure that that is always illegal and kind of setting in place that framework that sets expectations right from the beginning. We think you should have rights not to be subject to dismissal due to a mistake in data processing. Again, we don't want to get to the situation where you're taking a tribunal because you've been subject to dismissal because of inaccurate data processing. We want everybody to be thinking about that right from the start and designing that into how they're using technology in the workplace. And we also really importantly think that we need a comprehensive right to human review of data-driven decisions, so that if you do think something's gone wrong, you've actually got somebody to talk to about that. Lastly, and perhaps slightly less about data, but I think it is really important to mention kind of in terms of how we're using technology in the workplace, we're calling for a right to disconnect, which would follow kind of best practice in many European countries now. I think it's now been introduced in Ireland to just say we need to reinforce the boundaries between work and home. And I was thinking, it's lovely if you're doing your emails while looking at a lake, but sometimes you just want to be looking at the lake and not doing your emails, and it's really important we enhance that too. So I think, as I said, we're really positive about the future of work, and there's lots of different angles we could talk about that. We're really positive about the possibility of technology to enhance it, but we need to set out a framework in which that technology is being used to make work better, not simply to make it more tightly controlled.
Thank you. That was brilliant. So there is a lot of optimism so far, and I'm going to go to you next, Doniya, and talk about. Are you optimistic about the skills landscape in a world that's becoming more digitalized with more flexibility? Do employers and do educational institutions, have they been given new opportunities because of digitalization and technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, my name is Doniya. I work at Multiverse. We're an apprenticeship training provider, creating an outstanding alternative to university and corporate training. As I wanted to talk a little bit about digital skills, the broader digital skills landscape, as well as the landscape for flexible working and where skills and productivity come into that more specifically. So it's clear that digital skills are absolutely critical in the future of work for a number of reasons, whether we're thinking about the workforce of the future as well as the jobs of the future, but also in the transition to remote and flexible working. So as we saw when we sort of transitioned to remote and flexible working during the pandemic, digital skills became a critical element. You would have to be able to be digitally literate to be able to access all of your work online if that was where your company was going, but as well as if you wanted to access new jobs, you had to be able to apply and do everything online. So it really threw into stark light the importance of digital skills. And more importantly, I think upskilling and reskilling are integral to achieve the needs of the economy. I wanted to really touch on two things that I've been hearing a lot about at conference so far. What I've been hearing a lot about are the importance of older workers, so people who are 50 plus leaving the economy, and that's that's something that it's a trend, and that's going to impact the future of work. But also, SMEs and SMEs having a lack of access to skills and the adequate training that they need. So I wanted to talk about how apprenticeships can help with both of those elements. So firstly, for older workers in particular, we see that there's a real big opportunity to use apprenticeships to reskill or upskill individuals who are considering leaving the labor market. We have a client who was shutting down physical branches of a bank, but instead of letting go those workers, they are putting them on a program to reskill into data analytics and business transformation and software engineering. So we're seeing that there's opportunities there to use apprenticeships and other forms of skills and training to get people back into the labor market or keep them in the labor market. Secondly, with apprenticeships and remote working in particular, we're seeing that work has become a lot more competitive in a way. So there's a lot more opportunities for larger organizations to hire anywhere, not just in the locality that they are, but also for individuals who are highly skilled to work anywhere. So that has implications for labor laws, of course, but also it means that employers should really be providing their work with their employees with the right skills so that they'll be able to thrive in the current economy, but also the economy of the future. So it's sort of a catch-22 because it means that people are potentially, not going to get a job because there's someone else in a different region that can do it. But on the flip side, it means that we're able to sort of decentralize and maybe perhaps move away from cities as much and consider the leveling up agenda when we look at where people can work and where they can live. So I think that's another big element of the future of work is moving away from place-based work and skills. And I think lastly, a big theme that I'm seeing in terms of the future of work and skills is the importance of community. And we're seeing that even though individuals who might not be coming into the office as much or perhaps want to go into the office, community is incredibly important regardless of what your situation is. So we really think that providing companies and organizations with apprenticeship programs allows individuals to work with each other, maybe move away from silos, meet people in the business that they've not met before as they're in a cohort and they're learning new skills together. And it just allows more broadly ability to establish a community and take that forward. So yeah, those are my couple of big thoughts and broad points on digital skills and apprenticeships.
Thank you very much. You painted I think, really interesting picture of how digital skills can both empower employees and those who are training, but also can pose some dilemmas for them. Yeah. I'm going to move to Francis next. You're head of talent and skills for COADEC. So I think you occupy this really interesting place in the sense that your organization is representing many of the businesses of the future, but also the employees of the future in the sense that it's in many respects a very specific set of skills, highly demanding, highly competitive environments. How do you engage in the future of work in the startup community when startups themselves are often sort of at the cutting edge of what employment is and what the economy can be?
So I think as a result, so for those of you who don't know us, we're from COADEC. COADEC is the Coalition for a Digital Economy, and essentially we're the not-for-profit voice of tech startups in Whitehall and Westminster. And in simple terms, we stand up for the little guys in the tech ecosystem. So I don't think we see any different patterns to anyone else, and I'll come on to this. In some cases, I think we see earlier examples of trends that will then come across over to traditional businesses. Future of work, it's a pretty big topic, and we've got 45 minutes, I've got 5, so it'll always a stop tour. But if we sort of one message in terms of thinking about it, firstly, there's in 20 years' time what we'll be doing. So that's Doniya's point on skills, technical learning, but also there are points on how we'll be working and where we'll be working, and that's some of the points made by others on the panel. Looking for a second at changing working patterns. Say, for example, I've got part-time skill as a photographer. I work in office sort of most of the time, but I do wedding photography, portrait photography. It's my hobby and it brings in some extra money. I can find clients in 2 ways, one of which is friendship networks, sort of Facebook, send networks, put a note in the local newsagents, that sort of thing. Or I can use an online platform in order to connect me with clients. It's often safer. There's often more protection for me, especially in terms of getting paid. Tech hasn't changed the working pattern, but it's made it a lot easier. And in the startup world at the moment, we're seeing an explosion of models like that. So across every area of work and every area of the economy, so you've got accountants, lawyers, cleaners, hairdressers. Saw something on the tube for gig economy voiceover artists. The nature of technology has made it a lot easier for people to find work if you're wanting to work flexibly online. Just to give a cool example of that, so a startup that we're aware of, say you're a student, you need to bring in some extra money, you want to become a web designer, you want to become a coder, you want to become a copywriter, similar. But say your campus is in a location where there aren't those businesses locally, and also it's difficult to get into that kind of work as a student. There's a particular platform that lets you take on that work remotely. You earn the same as you might do behind the bar in the local, but it's something on your CV for the area of work you want to enter into. It is huge potential for social mobility. The other point which I think has been picked up on as well, imagine, and I'm going to say mum because I think as often as it has been said, sadly, we are not yet at the point of entirely gender-neutral parental care. The parent around the kitchen table, they may not be able to engage in 9-to-5 jobs because they've got other commitments. But again, coder, web designer, copywriter, flexible work, and the digital economy allows them a way to remain in the workforce. None of this is new, but technology is enabling it. We're also seeing increasing changing attitudes to flexible work. On the polling we've done, as you go, this won't, I think, surprise anyone in the room, as you go down the age brackets, more and more people want their work to be flexible. But the block we've got is the legislation is not necessarily up to date. So my photographer example, if I get a booking to take photos at a wedding and I do that through notice in the local newsagent, I'm self-employed. If I do that online, there is a risk, depending on my terms of the platform, and it's very, very unclear at the moment that I could be classified as an employee, and that would significantly restrict the flexibility that I went into that to do. So that's one consideration. Other areas where startups are first movers. So we all know about hybrid working, I think it's been touched on. It is also a very important point, as Kate's made, that is specific to white-collar working, and it is a mistake to let the narrative spread across the economy. It is only people who are otherwise working from a laptop, but increasingly what we're also seeing, startups are hiring for roles that are 100% remote. And that has opportunities, and that's got threats. So talk to startup in Newcastle, say you're looking for someone with a particular skill set, say in coding, for example. They don't now need to move out of Newcastle to be able to hire people for that job. They can hire people who are 100% remote. That's great, but they're also then competing on salary with startups in Silicon Valley. There's also a flip side of that. So say you're a coder living in Newcastle, say there are maybe 10 or 20 jobs in your area of specialism. Now you don't need to move to find those jobs, that's great. But you're also competing on salary with people living in countries who may have a much, much lower cost of living than we do. Linked to that, there's, I think this week Spain released news of a digital nomad visa. You can work from anywhere, as they say, you know, go and work from a beach in Spain, great. Raises questions for us in Britain, what's our USP? I'm not going to talk about apprenticeships, as Doniya has done that far better than I would. Though I would, one, make point on digital skills in tech. So university is a great option for some, it's not a great option for others. It's 3 years and you're incurring a lot of debt. In tech particularly, it's sometimes not the best option. 3-year curriculum, probably written by academics. There is a risk that your skills are out of date by the time you finish that course, even if they're up to date when it started. There's really interesting stuff happening in the space, coding boot camps, short courses that teach you a particular skill. It especially allows people to change careers. But if you're 18, you can get a student loan for a 3-year course. If you're 30 and you're working in Greggs and you're looking to learn a new skill, in theory, you can do that. You go to coding a boot camp, it's great. But how are you going to pay for it? There are policy options, but that is another area we should be thinking about. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour. I think, again, just to emphasise some of the points in the panel, technology is a tool. It can be used good or badly. There are huge opportunities in this space. There are also huge threats, and we need to be thinking about both of those. Sort of starting with a kind of personal anecdote. So I had an Irish granny. And my Irish granny said to me when I was 5, right, you know, she grew up in a rural area, and she said, right, you know, you need to be able to tack up a horse and carriage in case you're ever, it was a sensible thing, in case you're ever in an isolated area and you need to go for help. And she was right, you know, she lived rurally. But I'm now 29. In an emergency, I've had to drive a car. In an emergency, I've needed to change a car tyre and I haven't been able to. I've never needed to, in an emergency, tack up a horse and carriage. And that's the risk in this space, that we identify the right stuff, but in trying to fix it, we go back to what we know, rather than the way the world's changing, and the world is changing rapidly. And the one point I'll leave you on it, this area does offer huge opportunities for the mum at the kitchen table, the 30-year-old who wants to change career, but we need legislation that will support that rather than cripple that.
Thank you very much. So opportunities and also dangers. In the future of work, how does the Labour Party go about maximising those opportunities and minimising the dangers?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it's such a vast topic, isn't there? And there's so much to cover. And in some ways, that's my starting point, because I think there is something of a vacuum at government, because governments, and I've worked in government as a special advisor, so it's not a sort of partisan point, it's just more the structure of government. You become very siloed, and these issues in the labour market obviously spread across a number of government departments, the Treasury, the BEIS, the Department of Work and Pensions, which I know now shadow, now the Department of Culture, Digital, and so on, and health and education and skills as well. And government departments all and ministers and civil servants all beaver away in their areas. And actually, I think we need to step back and have a strategic look at the future of work and what is needed in a way in which perhaps we were better at years ago. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should bring back things like manpower commissions and all that kind of stuff, but I do think there is a role for government to step back from all this and have a much more considered look about what is going on in the labour market, because there are a number of different trends going on here, a lot of which are related, and I just want to touch upon some of them. I mean, first of all, in the pandemic, we've obviously seen this dash for digital, if you like, a move to laptop Britain, which is it's great if you've got the opportunity to sit in front of a beautiful lake while you're doing your emails and so on. But it's not necessarily great for everybody because of perhaps the nature of the housing that they live in, the circumstances of their lives. I mean, it's not perfect for everybody, that setup. The second point is there are undoubtedly opportunities that digital brings. Absolutely, and we have to think that through, because there are some dangers, and I'm going to caricature to be deliberately provocative to get the debate going, but we know that there are those who, using the advantage that digital platforms give them, who are providing a service to better off people. And what are their opportunities? There is a fear that our labour market becomes sort of U-shaped, if you like. Lots of lower paid jobs at this end, Uber drivers, Deliveroo, etc., etc. Servicing, lots of very well-paid people at this end. And the challenge, if you like, I mean, this is a slightly, nostalgic view of what life used to be like, but, I'm being deliberately provocative. In the olden days, it was theoretically possible to go from factory floor to management, to go from factory floor to upstairs to, or something. Is there a route for the Uber driver to become an Uber coder in this economy? I think that's, I would say at the moment, not particularly. And how do we deal with that? Second thing is, there are these other trends going on in the labour market that we also have to contend with at the same time, which is, frankly, we don't have enough people. We've got a labour supply problem. Now, I actually thought Friday's budget, I'm a Labour politician, so I thought the inequalities and the distributional impact of Friday's budget, I find that obscene because I'm a Labour politician. We seem to have not sure what it is, something flying around. Is it a moth? Is that what it is? Yeah. Has your treasurer got their wallet out? Is that what it is? I actually find the distributional impact of Friday's budget obscene. I'm a Labour politician. You'd expect me to say that. I actually think the economics of it are nuts as well, because even if it's on its own terms, suppose that those big giveaways to the very richest does stimulate demand in the economy and grows the economy. Where's the labour supply to match that demand? There isn't any. Now, they announced, for example, we're going to crack down on those working limited hours on universal credit. Well, most of those people, I've not looked at the figures, but I suspect most of those people are women with childcare responsibilities. And when you've got 1 million people in the labour market, cracking down on people working part-time, probably because they've got childcare responsibilities, 120,000 of them, it's not going to make our economy more productive, and it's not going to meet the vacancies that we've got in the economy. We do need supply-side reforms, but we haven't got any. And if you don't have supply-side reforms to match policies which, on their terms, they hope is going to stimulate demand, well, that's just going to be inflationary. So we need measures to make our economy, yes, of course, to grow our economy, but to stabilise the cost of living. So I would argue, and I've been talking about this in my conference speech today, when we know the 600,000 over 50s have left the labour market, some of that is because of sickness. Those leaving the labour market for reasons of sickness is rising at its highest level ever, and it's now at a 20-year high. Some of that is probably because some of those over 50s are squeezed because they might be caring for grandchildren on the one hand and may well be caring for a mum or a dad or a partner who sadly may have Alzheimer's or has had a stroke, so they're being squeezed. Some of it may also be just post-pandemic, a kind of, you know, sod this for a game of soldiers, and you can sort of get access to some of your pension or some savings. Now, that in itself is not, I mean, it might be great for that individual 50-year-old if they can survive on their whatever money they've got, but that is not sustainable from an economic point of view, not least because when you look at the challenges in our labour market, we're moving into the period now where the sort of final cohort of the baby boomers retire and leave the labour market. So we're going to be short of labour. So we need to be doing something to encourage people back to work. So why I would argue that we need to fundamentally reform things like Job Centre Plus and employment services to have a more universal offer to encourage people to move into work. So I think, you know, there's a lot going on here. I think it's a really interesting discussion, but this is one of the reasons why we in the Labour Party have got. I mean, Angela is our future of work shadow secretary is one of her titles. She's got lots of other titles as well, actually, but that's one of her titles. But I do think there are big challenges here which are not going to be resolved at the moment, and I'm not trying to be partisan for the sake of it, because that's never my style anyway. It's not going to be resolved by the current government setup, but I think you can in the end resolve it, but you've got to step back and have a more strategic approach to the future of work.
Thank you. Can I pick you up on one thing about the strategic approach to the future of work? You mentioned in your conference speech about the need to reform the benefit system, particularly universal credit.
Mm-hmm.
How does, especially in a world where most of our social insurance benefit systems operate in a world where the job market was quote unquote more traditional, how do you reform the social supports and the employment supports in the UK market in a way that that harnesses flexibility in a positive way?
Yeah, so I mean, I would argue that the DWP should be pursuing a positive, active labour market approach. So that means you do reform job centres, employment services, have a more universal employment service offer, like I've been talking about. But you also, if in the language which doesn't tend to get used anymore, but the sort of very new labour language of you need to make work pay. And there are aspects of the universal credit system which I think at the moment are undermining some of that. So when my colleague Johnny Reynolds was the Shadow Secretary of State, he did actually call for a reduction in the taper. To be fair to the government, they did pursue that, but there's other things in there, the way in which it impacts the self-employed. And there is things in there like, you know, the way in which the payment, you know, a monthly payment, but if you're paid every 4 weeks, you can find yourself plunged into debt because of just the nature of the payments, and all of a sudden you're in huge debts and so on. So there are elements in the design of the system which can be, I think, can be resolved and need to be resolved to encourage people to move into work and find or work more hours and move up the you know, increase their hourly their wage or get better paid, be paid better.
Thank you. I want to pick up another thing you mentioned, and I'll throw it open about the U shape.
Yeah.
Can an Uber driver become an Uber coder?
Yeah.
And I want to tie that into a point that Doniya made about community. Certainly, this is, I think, admittedly anecdotal, but it strikes me that something, certainly my generation, where flexible work, remote work, it's especially for young workers, they have less exposure to upper management or senior management. They therefore might have fewer promotion opportunities, or certainly don't have the learning through osmosis that one might get. How do employees, should they balance sort of, yes, the flexibility of hybrid work, but also the huge kind of productivity, human resources gains that you get from working in an office environment with superiors who have more skills and more human capital, I suppose, to put it in economist language. Maureen, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So first of all, we recognise that community element as well, and when we're seeing a fair amount of evidence at this sort of relatively early stage of people moving back to where they're from, to put it bluntly. And so, you know, if you went back, 15, 20 years, I think particularly in professional jobs, there was a sort of an assumption that people had to move to one of the big cities in order to be able to do that. That's, I think, not always the case anymore, and that I think is a good thing, although I recognise that's partial. I think the other point you mentioned, Connor, is absolutely something that we see, which is particularly younger people in our firm, not getting the time to sort of hear people who have experience in industry, not having time to socialise with colleagues, and that is something of a challenge. We're trying to in the post-pandemic environment where people have sort of in our industry successfully made the leap to work from home work. We're actually trying to encourage people back into the office for those reasons. So not because we want to see people in an office 3 days or 4 days or 5 days a week, but because we want to create an opportunity for them to come in and actually be surrounded by their peers and people from whom they can learn. But it's a work in progress.
Kate, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think this is a real concern, and I actually just wanted to raise a couple of concerns with some of the vision that Frances painted. Because I think, if we think about that mother around her kitchen table, the first question I'd be asking is, why can't she get a flexible job which fits with her childcare, where she doesn't have to stay at her kitchen table all day? She might like the opportunity to escape from her kitchen table.
Well, both.
Possibly.
It's not a contradiction.
The second thing I'm a little bit worried about is she going to be on a freelance basis? Is she going to be self-employed? Because if so, she hasn't got any sick pay. She probably doesn't have any training from the company, and she certainly isn't getting paid into a pension. So I think there's something, and when we talk about the kind of flexibility of the rules around self-employment, some of them are because we've had a long-term tripartite arrangement between the state, the employer, and the citizen about who pays when something goes wrong. And I think it's really important that we think about the implications of a more freelance basis when actually it's great, you're flexible, then you fall sick. This is what happens. Who's looking after you then? And I think we really have to take into account these considerations when we paint this kind of more flexible world, slightly more individualised, slightly more atomised. If the employer hasn't taken responsibility, ultimately it's either going to fall on the individual and the state, and I think we have to be taking those considerations into account when we design the future of work we want.
Frances, you'd like to respond, I think.
So yes, and I think those are very legitimate concern, and actually I think in theory I'd agree with everything Kate said. The one thing that's sort of a nuance to that is sometimes when you actually poll people, when you ask people who work in flexible jobs what they want, the answer is we do not want reciprocity of obligations. And it does vary, but so again, when we talk to startups who offer people, so say you've got, for want of a better phrase, carrying on both sides, so you've got children and you're looking after elderly parents, and often your week or your month or your working patterns, it will be determined by other obligations. If you ask people who are in those situations, they say, right, we do not want reciprocity of obligations and what that brings. But yes, it is something that the government does need to work out, but I'd be very, very wary about making it seem perhaps simpler than it is. I'm not certain there's a silver bullet that we found yet.
Yeah. I actually wanted to touch on something that we were talking a little bit about before, about promotions and retention in particular. So, again, not to bang the drum about apprenticeships, well, I mean, that's what I'm here for, to be honest. But we have found that, employers providing their employees with a structured training system really allows for greater retention and promotion opportunities and aspects. At Multiverse in particular, over 90% of our apprentices stay with their employer after finishing the apprenticeship, and 68% have reported a promotion or a pay rise either during or after the completion of their apprenticeship. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, the apprentice or the employee feels like they are being invested in by their organization and their company, and that's really important for well-being in the workplace, and knowing that you're valued and that your promotion and progression is valued. Secondly, I believe that there is again, it goes back to the community element, because during an apprenticeship, you are part of a cohort. You do meet people in the organization that you wouldn't have met otherwise, potentially, and you actually meet people in other organizations as well. So there's a real, I think, opportunity that when investing in skills, either from an employer perspective or from a governmental perspective, there's a clear return on investment when it comes to keeping people engaged in the labor market and progressing in the labor market and building their wages as well. So I just wanted to touch on those two elements.
Can I go to the Shadow Secretary of State about sort of this U-shape? How does DWP, how should it engage better with the skills system and with the education department?
Yeah, well, that's a really, that's a great question.
Because it seems to me that's what we're in some ways alluding to.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. And it reminds me a bit of, as you know, I spent I think it was forever in the health and social care world. And you know, if I was at no doubt a policy exchange, health and social care fringe, we'll be talking about, you know, how do we integrate health and social care, and why can we never integrate it, even though politicians always stand up and say we should integrate it. I'm back in this world of DWP, the way in which skills support is integrated with employment services, I don't think works, and I don't think we've quite cracked it. I'd actually asked a former civil servant this once, who was in the old Department for Education and Employment, which existed in the mid to late 90s. And I sort of just floated the sort of, you know, should employment go back into the Department for Education? And they said to me, oh no, it was terrible in them days. The employment civil service civil servants never spoke to the education civil servants, and vice versa, because the Department for Education is always sort of focused on schools and so on. I mean, I don't know if they were caricaturing it, but I imagine there's some truth in that. And of course, eventually that's where the Department of Work and Pensions came from. So. New Deal and things like that came to when Labour got elected, came to the what then became the Department of Work and Pensions, replacing the old Department of Social Security. So I don't think we've ever really cracked this, how we properly integrate. And one of the things I've been looking at is, at the moment, the Department for Work and Pensions contracts with the big, effectively the big national outsourcing companies to provide job support. You know, I don't want to name them because it'd be invidious to pick on anyone, but you know, the usual ones who always win government contracts, who then subcontract down. And one of the things I think I would want to do, and one of the things we are looking at, is if we can move away from that model and say to a local area, I mean, there'll be a debate, I suspect it'll have to be on one of these combined authority footprints, say to Andy Street or Andy Burnham or whoever it is, here's what the money we think, you know, based on whatever formulas we use, you need in your area for employment support and so on, and you at a local level work out how to spend that money, who to contract with, what local organisations to work with, and so on. Because at the moment, essentially the DWP is giving a contract to one of the big outsourcing companies who subcontracts, essentially buys some skills support from the Department for Education or the skills agency for which the money has been devolved down to. And I think a lot of people are getting a poor deal out of that. So I'm up for changing that system.
Yeah. Francis, I think you'd like to mention something.
So just to add in on that, I can't remember offhand the statistics on upskilling. So if you are currently in private sector employment, how much money is actually spent on your continued training? But if you look them up, they are pretty tiny. And it's a huge opportunity for government. And also, again, looking at Doniya again, I think it was you that said to me, we talk about things like apprenticeships, referring to people, and we think of them as referring to people who are 18. We do not need to think of apprenticeships in that way. And then when we look at other things, so digital upskilling, coding boot camps, we do not need to think of upskilling as something that happens between the ages of 18 and 21. There's far, far more out there.
On that point, Doniya, can you speak more to what has been most successful in getting sort of non-traditional age apprenticeships successful and recruiting and upskilling?
Yeah, I mean, I think non-traditional age is quite funny because no matter what way you paint, you offend someone by calling someone old. Someone will be offended. No one is old. We're all young at heart. But non-traditional age, I think it's what we're seeing at Multiverse in particular is when it comes to individuals who are doing an apprenticeship that aren't, 18 to 25, for instance, it's often individuals who are already employed at an organization and are looking to upskill or reskill, as I've said a few times. And the way that we go about it is going to organizations, going to companies. It not necessarily tech companies. We work with all sorts of organizations all across the sector. And we say, for instance, you might be facing a productivity problem, you might be facing a retention problem, you might be facing a attraction problem. Whatever that problem is, what are the skills gaps that you face in your organization, and which people are more likely to benefit from being upskilled in a certain area? So that's why we see a big uptick in organizations coming to us for data analytics support. We've got data literacy, data analytics, business, digital transformation, etc. And I think exactly as you said, Francis, it's not necessarily about that one shot of learning from when you're 18 to 21 at university, and then that's it. You've done your learning. You're in your career now. Good luck. It's about, in your career, you might start off as a certain role and then transition into a different role in the department or organization, and you might need skills that aren't necessarily as easy to learn through osmosis through your colleagues. You might need training support. I think that's a big part. And I just wanted to touch on boot camps, which I think again are a really good way to get skills into the labor market, and it's a really effective way to get people to think about digital skills. But I do think that there's a potential risk with boot camps insofar as that they're not as well regulated as other forms of training and skills. And I sometimes think that government and organizations are prone to complicating the already extremely complicated skills landscape by adding in more and extra elements into the skills market. So I think it's always worth thinking about how existing mechanisms can be used to improve whatever the problem might be, instead of adding in new elements at various different points of the system.
That's a really good point. Now I'll throw it open to questions. I'll take them in batches if that's okay. The only requirement, the Policy Exchange like to say there's no question too outrageous. Please just raise your hand, say your name and the organization you're affiliated with. Any questions on the floor?
It's Benjamin Barnard. I'm actually the head of technology policy at Policy Exchange. Since we've got the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions on the panel, I wonder whether we might talk about digital transformation and the skills that civil servants have. It's obviously been something that's been holding back the Department of Work and Pensions for ages. And I wondered, particularly around Department of Work and Pensions and inclusion, whether there's something that might be done around trying to increase access to tech and what Labour's policies towards that might be.
To be clear, this has not been coordinated.
Oh, really? I do apologise.
Right, do you mean the skills and abilities of civil servants and officials?
So what can be done to improve the skills of civil servants? What might be done to encourage digital transformation within the department when you take it on?
Yeah.
But more seriously, if we are going to do job coaching and we're going to embrace this world of flexible work, what can be done to help those perhaps on benefits and others to develop those digital skills to get them back into the job market?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've not worked in government since my party was kicked out of government, 12 years ago. So I can't quite comment on what the skills levels of today's civil servants are. But obviously, I would imagine as I was running a department, I would want to invest. There's no shadow treasury ministers there, is there? No. I'd want to invest in the skills and talents and abilities of our civil service. I mean, there is a point which I think is maybe not so much for this panel, but is one that we have explored at sort of similar sort of fringe events, and we've explored with the TUC a little bit. Is that we often get told that the things that we want to do to reform and change the universal credit system can't possibly be done because the computer systems won't allow it, or it'll take so long for the computer systems to be updated. I mean, I would only say, and you may feel this is slightly, maybe I'm being sort of, maybe a cheap political point, but it's actually not my point. It's a point that I'm told Frank Field makes, is that, we spent millions and millions on a fancy universal credit system. It takes weeks to get people their payment, and apparently takes ages to change anything. Whereas in the old days, someone would fill in a form, it would get sent to Blackpool, get processed, and you'd get your first payment within a week and a half. Yeah. So, I mean, but having not worked in government since 2010, I can't really judge on how fair that is or not. I think the other point is, look, there's obviously a move for clients, customers, benefit recipients, whatever phrase you feel most comfortable using, to try and interact with the government through digital platforms, which is totally understandable, and there are obviously efficiencies and savings to be made. But we mustn't underestimate how excluded some of society are, and it's not. This is not that there's lots of people out there who don't have don't know what they're doing. It's not that. It's not that. When you're in a cost of living crisis, what you're using the 5G on your phone to do becomes very precious. And bear in mind, a lot of people now, you know, homework for your children virtually always comes on an app now, which a lot of families, A, probably don't have a printer. I mean, but B, you know, they've got to somehow share their homework on their phone or share their children's homework on their phone. I mean, these things all use up their 5G if they don't have a good Wi-Fi deal. So, look, it's totally understandable why the government will say, for efficiency purposes, we want more people to apply online, etc., etc. But we mustn't underestimate how many people are excluded from this, or their ability to interact with some of this is limited, particularly in a cost of living crisis.
I think, Kate, you wanted to pick up on that, and then I'll take one more from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, just on the kind of skills of civil servants, 2 points to make. One is, obviously, civil servants have been underpaid for a decade now, and many of the civil servants delivering in Job Centre Plus are themselves claiming benefits because they are, you know, their pay has been frozen for so long. So I think if we want to invest in their skills, we've also got to pay them. But I do think there is a point about investing in the skills of people who are, for example, contracting the IT. And frankly, I think DWP was turned over by successive IT consultants in the delivery of universal credit, where, you know, we had agile technology, then I can't remember what the next phrase was, but the delivery of universal credit was significantly late. Still, not everybody is on universal credit. Every time the government has said, you know, we'd like to change the policy, the IT has said no. I don't believe that can be possible, and I guess if I was in Jonathan's place, I'd want to employ somebody who could tell them that is going to be possible, get on with it.
I think we had a question there.
Yeah, I'm Devon. I'm the Director of Policy and Practice and also work on Universal Credit Centre for Social Justice, trying to avoid Kate's eye. She was glancing at me, making those points there.
Sorry, Devon.
I'm going to challenge and say, actually, does anyone on the panel see the potential for digital within government, particularly DWP, accelerating? Because there's so much more you could do to help people access all of the support they might be eligible for within a cost of living crisis that we're not currently doing at all as an organisation now, outside of government running one of the benefit calculators. There's so much more you could do with universal credit data that sits there. We're helping councils across London increase take-up of pension credit through some of the data that they hold. There's so much more you could do, and I think we're kind of, it's a challenge to say, to ask, does anyone see investing much more in the ability of those departments to unleash that potential of fundamentally what is a public asset, that data?
I think Francis, you wanted to pick up on that.
So yes, coming in from that from startup perspective, sort of 2 points. One of which is not just government, but also corporates and the public sector generally. It's quite easy to go to standard set of big providers, I think Jonathan's mentioned. Quite often, you've got really interesting, innovative solutions out there, some of which are startups, so I'm just getting that in there, but other innovative solutions out there that are not always deployed. So there's one example, so a startup that we work with. So there are negative uses of AI, and there are also very good ones. So we speak to someone who procures to local government to effectively predict when families are likely to default on council tax and when families are likely to need additional support from local council. And that's use of AI, and that's a startup procuring to government. So yes, absolutely, there's huge opportunities for innovation there. And I would just also like to pick up on the point on digital skills. So when we talk about digital skills, I think it's important to split these into two things. So there's skills for sort of high skill tech, which is kind of where I'm, Doniya, speaking, but also the hugely, hugely important point on, for a better phrase, digital literacy. I remember sort of sitting doing some work in a library and seeing someone next to me being shown how to use Google Maps in order to get to a funeral. And we often sometimes in spaces like this, we forget where the level of digital literacy is, and that's also an opportunity. And it's also an opportunity for government, but yes, it does need to be fixed.
Sorry.
You and then...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it sort of ties into the question about upskilling individuals in the civil service, and I actually think that there is a huge amount of really interesting data that's available to the civil service that often individuals are either too stretched to be able to manually or you know, to analyze efficiently, or on the other hand might not have the skills. So I think that there is a sort of two-pronged approach is definitely to invest in the digital skills of the civil service and getting individuals the right sort of training so that they can access and use the data in the most effective way. But I think that DWP has the potential of working, in collaboration with DFE and DCMS on the basic digital skills work. And I know that there's a huge amount of work on basic digital skills and digital literacy, and I think that there is definitely scope for more joined up working to ensure that the right people are getting access to basic digital skills. And I know that there's work that's being done through the devolved adult education budget. That's what was my previous hat. But I think that there's a lot of lack of interoperability that's leading to people not being able to access the things they need to do.
So I think to answer directly, and my own answer is, I don't know. And that may seem slightly flippant, and I don't mean it to. And the point I'm making is, what has struck me since I've moved over to this brief from, as I say, what felt like forever in the health and social care brief, what a lack of transparency there actually is around data. I mean, you've obviously got experience with the system, and so you obviously know what data is available. But I do find it very striking that in the health service, in the health world, that you know everything. The data on everything and every aspect of it is published everywhere. It's impossible not to know what is going on. It's impossible not to know the burden of ill health for whatever condition it happens to be in the health service. And what really strikes me in dealing with the Department of Work and Pensions, how much they completely close down and do not want to share some of this data. So I suspect you are probably definitely right. There will be much more sophisticated things we can do, but I do think there is a problem with the way in which our benefit systems work. I don't mean the headline figures. I mean, the headline numbers are on their data, on their published data sets, but you don't know specific figures about particular job centres, for example, and so on. And I don't understand why the DWP feels so anxious about hiding a lot of this data away. I don't think it needs to. I don't see why it needs to. So I suspect you were probably right. And I was being deliberately sort of slightly flippant in my answers to sort of make the point I was trying to make. So yes, undoubtedly. And if you want to have a conversation about how an incoming Labour government could do it, absolutely.
Can I expand to Morgan and talk about, we were discussing sort of kind of the limitations of digital inclusion. As a financial services, as a bank in the digital space, how do you guys go about conceptualizing that problem? And this is less of a work question, but certainly one about money, access to cash, and what digital firms in that space can do.
Yeah. It's a very good question, right? So obviously the industry is moving in a digital direction, but clearly we as an organisation, as the industry, has a responsibility to try to help with digital literacy, but also to make sure that people who are not digitally literate are not cut off from the system. So we have sort of programs in place to try to bring that to effect. But there's more to be done, to be honest. I think that there's a real risk that in conversations like this one, it's very, very easy to assume that digitization is the future, but for some people it won't be, right? For some people, and it's not just, someone made a very good point earlier, that isn't just an age point, right? A lot of it is socioeconomic, some of it is reluctance, whatever it might be, that we can't have a situation where people are cut off from, in our case, banking services, but provision of other services as well, simply because they don't have access to 5G or a smartphone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm realizing we're now getting very short on time, so if I can ask every panelist to do maybe a 30-second, 1-minute summing up about kind of key points you'd like to get across, and then we'll break for the evening. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say it's a very good discussion. I think fundamentally, to resolve some of these deep-rooted issues in the economy, we've got to improve labour supply, and that does involve skills, it does involve training, also involves healthcare as well, and I think it does involve some fundamental reforms at the DWP.
I think we can have definitely a better future of work. Tech can help us deliver that, and it can help us deliver better services as well, including at the DWP. But in order to do that, we've got to set out what aims we want, not think what can we do, and then let that dictate what we do.
Similarly, we've got huge opportunities for future work. I thought it was a big topic when I came into this. I think it's an even bigger topic now, but I think actually the core point one made by Jonathan, it is cross-department, it is cross-society, and it is public, private, and third sector. And when we think of it, we frame it in that way. But we can think of it in a way where we think about opportunity and where the potential improvements are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think investment in skills is absolutely critical to any sort of future of work conversation, and not just investment in basic digital skills, which is really important, but also aspirational digital skills. We shouldn't limit ourselves to just considering basic digital skills, but thinking about how Britain can become the most innovative digital economy. Also improving access to apprenticeships and understanding about apprenticeships, and not the fact that they're not just necessarily for 18 to 25-year-olds, but also on the flip side for 18 to 25-year-olds to understand the opportunities that apprenticeships could provide them in sectors such as tech, which is something we didn't touch about, but I think but I think is incredibly important. And lastly, I think investment in skills is really important because of competitiveness, as we talked about the future of work and remote working, and investment in Britain and everywhere else in the world. We should make sure that the people in our economy have the best skills they could possibly have.
There have been some sort of quite interesting, quite big questions about structural reform, about strategic approaches to the labour market. I don't think that we at Virgin Money are well placed to necessarily answer those. I can speak only for our small part of the employer universe. It has worked well for us, asking our employees what they want rather than trying to tell them what they should have. So we're going to try to keep iterating that approach as we go forward, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit more.
Thank you. So lots of opportunities in the future of work, but obviously you need to get the policy right. Thank goodness Policy Exchange is here to talk about the policy. With that plug, have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, panelists.